All right, yesterday in our whirlwind tour of American history, we finished up the section that I've got titled Establishing the General Government, putting this theme together, and then a lot of that was us establishing things with other countries, treaties, negotiations, wars, the War of 1812. There's a whole lot here. There's this new country tries to settle in as in the international arena. So we finished up all that, the War of 1812, hit the Monroe Doctrine at the end, and then just started into a section that we are going to do quickly anyway, and we're going to especially quickly now that Gregory's here, we can really get going. What's that? So, I shouldn't make fun of you because sometimes I get stuck like that. But the printers worked yesterday. All right, so we were going to do this quick anyway and just kind of skim through the early presidents and some things that happened there, but we'll trim it down and make it even quicker. So, all right, yesterday we had George Washington, and the primary thing there that we mentioned was the farewell address and some very good advice he gives. And then the precedent here of him stepping down, not fighting for power, and not being bloodshed with the transition of a new leader. All right, the next thing, this is for the reading, chapter 8. The next is John Adams. He's the next president. I want to mention a couple of things. Maybe two things. Two things with him. The first one is the Alien and Sedition Acts. These come along in 1798. Alien and Sedition Acts. This is, we're in the middle of the French Revolution era, Napoleon, and all of these revolutionary ideas spreading across Europe. It was aimed at not allowing those ideas to grab a hold in America. So that's where the alien and sedition part comes from. Alien, they weren't worried about Area 51 and the aliens that the federal government is capturing and is refusing to tell us about. Talking about foreigners, aliens. We have a couple in our room. So. And sedition, trying to overthrow the government and cause problems. So most of these were not an issue at all. One adjusted the amount of time that a foreigner had to live in America before they became a citizen. So it adjusted things like that. The one that did arouse a lot of controversy, this is a series of laws that passes these Alien and Sedition Acts. The one that caused controversy was called the Sedition Act. It was the last of these that comes along. And what it did is it made it a crime. Several things were a crime, but the part that was significant, to make or publish false, scandalous, or malicious. That was a quote from the law. False, scandalous, or malicious statements about the government. So it was a crime to say something scandalous about the government. Right? It was a crime to say something malicious, like, I think Obama wants to take all of her guns away so he can have absolute control. That was a crime by the Sedition Act. All right, so anyway, that's hopefully, is a way overreach, especially in our constitutional system. That should not be a crime to make these scandalous and malicious statements against the government. We wouldn't be able to talk about Bill Clinton if we couldn't talk about scandals. I mean, that's so, and that's his whole presidency. One scandal, and Obama's isn't really that much different. So it made it illegal to do that, and that aroused a lot of controversy. The only people, there were 25 newspapers that eventually get targeted with this thing. They were all from the other political party. Right? The political parties are just forming at this point. We have Adams and him representing the Federalist Party at this point, and then the other side is the Democrat Republicans, or Republicans, not the current Republicans. It's the way early forerunners of the current Democratic Party. All of the people that were prosecuted were in the other political party. All right. Hopefully that doesn't settle too well with you there. Anyway, way beyond the role of the government. So this thing aroused a lot of protests. There were states that passed resolutions declaring this a violation of the Constitution, which which it was. All right, so it settles down. It doesn't blow up into a mess that it could have been, but definitely was a controversial thing during the Adams administration. Okay, so we have the Alien and Sedition Acts, and the key one there was the Sedition Act that made it a crime to do that, to false, scandalous, and malicious statements. All right, the other thing to mention with him is the midnight judges. You know, Bill Clinton had midnight basketball. That was his solution to gang violence. Have basketball leagues that played in the middle of the night. Maybe that's what Tuesday night's game was, to keep you guys out of trouble. You know, play late at night. So, all right. Just as Adams is leaving office, he appoints a bunch of judges to positions in the judicial branch. And it's referred to as midnight judges because it happened at the very tail end and literally in the middle of the night before he leaves office. It was right at the tail end. So, a law had just passed through Congress, creating a whole bunch of new positions. He appoints all these guys, a total of, let's see here, 16 federal judges and then another 58 positions in the judicial branch. So what is that, 64, 74 different positions he fills as he's leaving office. It sets the stage for a big fight. You know, he appoints them, he leaves office, and then they have to be approved by the Senate if they're going to take their positions. We have a new president in. Most of them never get their positions, but it does set up a big fight, and it goes to the Supreme Court, and a big argument there, those midnight judges. There's one guy that he does appoint that gets his position that does have some long-term merit. John Marshall was the guy that he appoints. He becomes the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he holds that position for a long time. And he does a whole lot to establish the courts as a viable third branch of the government. Now, we've seen the courts, they've gone way overboard, exerting power and authority that they don't have. But prior to this, it was almost a non-entity. You know, it didn't have the authority, it didn't have the capacity to really rein in the other branches, and he establishes it as that significant thing. So John Marshall here, really the guy that puts some teeth into the constitutional authority of the court system. So, all right, so John Adams, a couple of things with him. Let's mention Thomas Jefferson. We're not going to mention any particular thing with him, just kind of a general thing. And the general thing is that when he comes into office, we have the first real political shift. All right, Washington and Adams were both of the same political party. Although it's hard to really say Washington was in a political party. But we have, Thomas Jefferson was on the opposite side from Adams. You know, when the Sedition Acts are passed and you know the opposite party is getting prosecuted, that was Jefferson's party. All right, so we have that first switch. It'd be like going from George W. Bush to Obama, or from Clinton to George W. Bush. We have that first shift. And again, it goes smoothly. I mean, if you can think of times in history where you have one political faction losing power and the other taking over, think of the French Revolution, which we're right in the middle of. Just kill everybody else. And that didn't happen. So a very smooth transition and a whole new flavor and style. Jefferson was very relaxed and calm. It said that he would answer the White House door himself. That'd be kind of refreshing. You go knock on the door. Someone tried to do that and they arrested him. You know, climbed over the fence, flew his plane. But go knock on the door and the president opens the door. Anyway. So very, very relaxed, casual lifestyle. Maybe a little bit too much. We were talking about the president, but oh well. Thomas Jefferson. All right, the next president after him is James Madison. And he was the next president. There was one main event that dominated his entire presidency. War of 1812. Okay, enough said. James Monroe, next president.
Can you repeat the one before James Monroe?
James Madison. Yeah. He was president for the War of 1812 that we discussed the whole war last class period. All right, James Monroe. All right, a couple things about him. He comes in after the War of 1812, and there we talked about that spirit of nationalism that was encouraged is one of the results of that. He rides that wave here. And he actually doesn't campaign for office. He just continues in his duties. He worked for the government and gets elected for office and steps. And so there's this spirit of unity and the whole nation wanting to work together. There are a couple of pieces of legislation that come as a result of this. One is the national bank is rechartered. We saw that done originally, and that was the big argument about strict and loose construction. That first bank was expiring, and they had to renew the legislation. And here in this spirit of unity and national pride, that goes through. A lot of people put aside their political beef with it. So we get that. And we also get a protective tariff passed, which economically is a stupid thing. But a protective tariff, charging foreigners money to bring stuff into the country. There are real and legitimate reasons for tariffs. To inspect cargo coming in, make sure they're not, have a boat labeled, Chinese knockoff coats or, garments, and in the hold there's little children tied up with chains that they're bringing in. There's some legitimate reasons to inspect and make sure what's actually happening. But a tariff to protect us from foreign trade. Economic is really a very damaging thing. But anyway, a protective tariff is passed in the spirit of nationalism and national pride. All right, one other thing I want to mention with him is an economic downturn that takes place under his presidency. It's called the Panic of 1819. And I mention this as much to say that the government was at the heart of it as anything. Right? I can't claim that I've studied every panic or economic downturn in American history, but every one that I have studied, the government plays a significant or major role in causing it. Right? And this one is no different. This is what happened. Following the War of 1812, there was a wave of people moving into the West, into this part of the world. And people began to buy land, and people were greedy and evil back then, and there were speculators. That's always what you call somebody who's greedy and evil that buys land. If they're honest and forthright, they're called investors. Right? But in this case, they're speculators. But people in the East or wherever, they would come to Indiana, or they weren't states at this point. This big hunk of land, and they would buy a big piece of land. It was being sold cheaply, and then they would subdivide it. And they would sell it to other settlers that were coming out. Maybe they would build a road in or something. And they would sell it off and make money on it. All right. And anyway, they were called speculators because they're blamed for this recession. So there's lots of people doing this. Lots of people borrowing money to do this, which that's shaky ground. All right. Eventually, that national bank that we saw just rechartered changed the rules about the way loans were being able to be given for people to buy land. Right, so all of a sudden, these people that had bought land and were planning on selling to other people, those other people couldn't get loans as easily. So the market dries up. And a lot of these people are stuck with borrowed money that they don't have, they can't repay it, and land that they can't sell. All right, and it sets up the stage for this panic of 1819 as people default on these loans, and then banks go bankrupt. Anyway, it's always blamed on the speculators, these nasty people who are buying land to gouge the farmers. And I know they were just investing money. I mean, not a stupid thing to do. We could talk about how they were foolish, borrowing money to do this, very, very shaky ground. But then the government's coming in and changing the rules mid-game. Imagine at halftime, the refs come out and say, all right, it's, what rules should we change? You have to dribble with your weak hand or something. Wait a second, you can't do that. So anyway, the government there, a critical, integral part here of the panic there of 1819. So, all right, enough said. Questions about the presidents? We talked about a lot of the meat of the things that happens in their presidency when we talked about the foreign affairs, that whole sweep of events. All right, now let's turn our attention to the last main topic, or at least head towards the last main topic. We're here about 1820, and the next main event on the horizon in American history is, if you're really desperate, you look on the timeline. Well, that, I'm sorry, next main event after that.
Oh.
A really big main event. Civil War is the next main event on the timeline, on the horizon. There's the war with Mexico and some other things in between there, but that's the next main event. So we're going to head that direction. There's a couple little side trails we have to take, but that's the main direction. This next topic points us that direction. It's called sectional differences. Right. We have that time frame right after the War of 1812. Everybody loves each other and hugs each other, and they pass legislation through Congress, and the era of good feelings. That ends, okay? And we go back to hating each other. So, if you were alive and old enough to pay attention, for a short time after 9/11, there was this talk of we've got to stand united, and we get some legislation passed, and new departments created in this united effort to fight communism. Well, Islamic terrorism. So we had that same type of feeling after the War of 1812, and that fades away. And we begin to see dominating some strife and rifts between different sections of the country. What I want to do right now is give you a list of some of the issues that pull these different parts of the country apart. I'm going to take one of them and look at just a little bit at it, because it gives us a good platform to discuss some things that come later on. So, all right, here's just some of the issues that we see different parts of the country taking different stances on. Okay, the first one is land policy. Right, by that we mean all of that land in the Northwest Territory, and now after the Louisiana Purchase, all of that land out there that is under the control of the federal government, and somehow we've got to. We don't want them. We don't want them to own all that land. We want to get it in private citizens' hands. So how that's going to take place? Some parts of the country thought the federal government should maximize their profit. This is a valuable commodity. Sell it at top dollar, that type of thing. Other parts of the country wanted to sell it very cheaply, get it into the hands of the people of America so they can move there and develop it, and that type of thing. Any guess about who was where on that? The main split here is north and south mostly. You may have a guess at what the north or the south, which position they would be in.
I'm going to go with the south one to sell it cheap and the north one to sell it expensive.
Okay, that's correct, but anything that pushed you that direction other than... They're the speculators. So, yes.
The north was much more industrialized, and the south needed much more land to plant their
Okay.
cotton.
Yeah, the South was very agricultural, so they were very much lent themselves to this. And the North was very agricultural. Wow. Had a lot of factories, industrial. And a lot of the Northerners, especially the owners of these businesses, didn't want this land sold cheaply because it was siphoning off their workforce. Right? We don't want our factory workers buying land in Iowa. We want them to keep working in our factories. So anyway, that split. Land policy. That does not eventually cause a civil war, but it's there. All right, another one is the bank, the national bank. Matthew got it right. Anybody want to take a wild speculative guess? I'm saying that because then you would be evil when you do this. If I said, make an educated guess, that would be good, but a speculative guess, that's bad. Anybody want to do that about the national bank? North and South, who is for, who is against? I might press you to tell me why you made your guess. Flipping a coin will not be sufficient. Anybody? Yes?
The North was against it, wasn't it? Because they didn't want people controlling their mind flow.
Oh, that actually, that does make a little bit of sense, but no, they're actually for it. They argued that we need a stable currency and that type of thing because of their financial interests. So the North is much more industrial, much more big business related, which is not evil, but much more that direction. So they were for it. The South was against it. So, tariffs. We saw the tariff being passed there in that sweep of air of good feelings. That becomes a point of contention. Some were for it, some were against it. We have that same split, North and South, for the most part. every now and then, some of these we can talk about the West having a different view than the other two, but for the most, it's North and South. Stephanie?
The South would be against it because they're heavily dependent on imports from the North would be for it because they want their goods. So.
Okay. The South produced a lot of cotton, especially as we get closer to the Civil War. At one point, 7/8 of all the cotton produced in the world came from the South. That's amazing. So they're selling cotton all over the place, and it's very typical for other countries to match your tariff. We charge somebody 10% to bring their goods in, then we get charged 10% to bring stuff into their country. So the South here didn't want a tariff because it was going to affect their trade. The North, who was making all kinds of things in these factories, they wanted the high tariff because then it made their competition in other countries have to pay this thing to bring it in. So North and South. Slavery. That one does become the key issue, right, obviously. And really don't paint all that. At the heart of the Civil War was slavery and the South's die-hard determination to keep it. I gave it away. The South was for it. The North was against it. Sorry. Two more here that don't so much split up easily that direction, but I should mention them. The presidential election of 1824. It more highlights this sectional difference that's forming. It's called the favored sons election because the North and the South and the West North and the West South, they all filled their own candidates, basically. They weren't saying, I'm the candidate of the North, but the North dominates favor for one candidate, and the South dominates favor for another candidate.
What year was it?
1824. All right, so anyway, we see that splitting up of political interest even in that presidential election already. So, all right, and last thing is balance of power in the Senate. This was an issue all the way through. We'll see it come up multiple times in the compromises and things. In fact, we're going to talk about one real quickly here, but balance of power in the Senate. The House of Representatives, its representation is based on population. The more people in your state, the more people you get to send to the House. That was at the heart of the 3/5 compromise. All right, they determined that the slaves would count as 3/5. So for every slave, you take the whole slave population and multiply by 3/5 to figure out how many people they got to send to Congress. It limited the influence of the slave-holding states. So it's often looked at as, slaves were only counted as 3/5 of a person. Well, if they'd been counted as a whole person, it would have given the slave-holding states more sway and control in Congress. So that's an incorrect way to view it. So the House is based on population, and the North dominated. There's much larger population in the North. It really wasn't a question. The North dominated the House. The Senate, however, it was 2 people per state. Every state sends 2 senators, regardless of the size. And there was an equal number of states, basically, through this whole time frame. So every time a new state was getting added, it brought up a big fight. Are they going to be a free state or a slave state? Because whichever way it went would upset the balance in the Senate. All right, so that becomes a major point of contention all through this time frame, the balance of power in the Senate. Okay, so the point there is there's these sectional differences forming. There are lots of contributing issues. The heart of it is slavery, and we will follow that later on, but that is the key one. But there were other contributing factors that pushed this into this position. So, all right, I want to mention 2 other things here with this sectional difference section. The first is the Missouri Compromise. This comes along in 1820. And then we want to talk about the Tariff of Abominations. It's an appropriately named tariff in light of today's world. All right, the Missouri Compromise. This comes along in 1820. All right, the background to this compromise very quickly is Missouri was applying for statehood in 1817. I thought you had a question. What issue instantly becomes a question? A new state's being added to the Union. Which one of those issues on the list?
Would be a free state or
Yeah, free or slave state, that balance of power in the Senate instantly became an issue. So it's 1817 they apply. If you notice the Missouri Compromise year, I think I gave to you, is 1820. It gives you a little idea of the rigmarole and the argument back and forth in Congress about what's going to happen. All right, so we have major arguments and fights in Congress. We have debate, not literally fist fights, but debates back and forth, amendments being proposed. This thing goes on and off from the time they apply for statehood through 1820. In 1820, or actually it was 1819, Maine applied to be a state as well. So now we have two states coming in, and that made it a whole lot easier. Maine wasn't really a question. They were going to be a free state, not a whole lot of cotton up there. And then it made it much easier for Missouri to come in as a slave state, since that balance was going to be established. So, all right, let me give you the actual compromise in 1820. That was two facets of it. Maine comes in as a free state. Missouri comes in as a slave state. All right, so we have that balance maintained for the time being. And then the third piece of this compromise was slavery was abolished above the 36th parallel, which is the northern border of Arkansas, basically. Right, Missouri came in as a slave state, but in all the rest of the Louisiana Purchase, there'd be no slavery north of that point. That eventually gets challenged, and the Bleeding Kansas, some other things come out of that fight for that. But at this point, no slavery north of that point in the territory, the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, so we have that compromise there in 1820. And again, at the heart of it was slavery, free or slave state. All right, the other thing I want to mention is a tariff. And this, anyway, the tariff is called the Tariff of Abominations. It's passed through Congress in 1828. And this is one story I should look into some more. I don't know the whole story. The Democrats, the modern Democratic Party, these guys would abandon the current Democratic Party in droves today. But anyway, they're forerunners of them. They were trying to set up some political trap for the president where he would veto this tariff. It was a political game. And I don't know the whole story, but they passed this really high tariff, and the president signs it. Nobody really wanted it, right? But all of a sudden we have this tariff. And that's the point I need to, I never have really delved into exactly how we get this tariff passed. But it passes through the legitimate channels. Congress gets to set these things. The president has to sign them like any other law. Legitimate thing. Nobody liked it, but it was the law. All right, it was the law. And it generates a lot of response here. 1828 was when this thing was passed. A very high tariff. Had flags flown at half-mast and all kinds of stuff. The thing I want to bring up is some of the southern states, it got so bad that even the vice president starts taking the position opposite the president. But some of the southern states began to talk about terms like nullification of acts of Congress and ignoring acts of Congress that they didn't like, which that same idea comes up with the Civil War and nullification and all kinds of things like that. But here we don't have the confusion of the Civil War to talk about, but I think here we can address this very much easier anyway. The idea of nullification is that a state can declare that something that the federal government does that is unconstitutional, to say that's wrong, you can't do that. If Congress passed a law declaring that, who do I want to pick? Anybody grow up in Indiana that didn't grow up at Fairhaven? Oh, Olivia. Congress passes law and the president signs it that Olivia is the governor. Indiana can say, no, she's not. We don't care what she passed. And in effect here, nullify the whole thing, because the Congress doesn't have the authority to just willy-nilly come and pick who the governor is going to be. I'm not saying you wouldn't be a good governor, but it would be an overreach by Congress to do that. So there is that that legitimate idea that if we do have the government overreaching its boundaries, the states, they do have and should have the capacity to defend themselves. They don't just have to buckle under. Right? Today we've gotten to the point where the states do buckle under, and there's a lot involved with that. A lot of it is the money. The government takes my money and your parents' money to Washington, and then they give it back to the states if the states agree to what they say. And really, it's a big racket. But the states buckle under too much today. At this point, the idea was really alive that the states shouldn't and didn't have to. And there were states who began to talk about it with this tariff. There were states that said, we're going to refuse to allow the tariff to be collected, and that type of thing. What do we think? Were they right in this point? Did the states have the right to say, we're not going to collect this tariff? Stephanie's saying yes or no?
Yes,
Okay, why?
because the state.
Let me back up. Let me phrase it. Where had the Constitution been violated? With Olivia, we would say that there's no constitutional authority for Congress to do that.
Because any power not directly given to the federal government is.
But the federal government is given the authority to establish tariffs. I think I'm not trying to trick you here, but it is explicitly given to Congress that they can establish a tariff. Nobody liked the tariff, but there had also been no violation of the Constitution. Does everyone follow that? These people just didn't like the tariff. It did not give them the authority to just ignore it. Right, does that make Matthew smiling at me? Right? It had been passed through the legitimate channels. The president had signed it. It was the law. If you don't like the law, you can go back to Congress and change it. But just to ignore it and say we're not going to allow it to be collected in our state is not within the state's authority. Does that make some sense? Part of the excuse that the South gives to leave was Lincoln being elected in a fair election. They say, oh no, we don't want him to be our president, and they walk out. It was a fair election. I mean, there's no grounds to walk out. Right? It'd be like us leaving the Union about Obama. That's different, I'm sure. Be no constitutional grounds to walk out. So anyway, here with this tariff, it was passed legitimately. Nobody especially liked it, but that did not give them the right constitutionally to ignore it or for states to rise up against it. So, all right, tariff of abomination. Questions there? I didn't mean to put Matthew on the spot. All right. Let us. We're going to skip over the less important things, famous preachers, Charles Finney, D.L. Moody, nobody important. Let's talk about technology. They are important, but technology. We have a wave of technological advances that starts basically just after America clears the Revolutionary War and gets their feet on the ground, all the way through today, really. And if you think about just this constant wave of technology and new things, I mean, if you think of just the last 100 years or so, when we start to fly, radio communication, television, go to space, I don't know if it's progress or not, internet and tweeting, and we have this constant flood of progress. I read a very interesting book once called The 5,000-Year Leap, and the basic premise of the book was that America in 200 years, or at least the 200 years from the time America was founded, that 200-year span, there was as much technological progress made as the previous 5,000 years. Right? And the guy goes through some of the features of America and the free market system and stuff that set the stage for that. But there's really an amazing run of technological advances. I'm sorry, it was shared by other countries too, but we're going to look at America. All right, so there's a wave of technology here. We're really kind of looking at it mid-crest. I mean, it goes past this time frame and starts before. But we're going to look at the parts here in this phase. All right, there's two parts of it, as I've got it split up into my notes, two very, very general parts. The agricultural revolution, there's a wave of technology in agriculture, and then the other is the Industrial Revolution, more machinery and factories and that type of thing. All right, so technology aside, just a couple of things here. First, there's a whole wave of new tools. That's kind of dull, but I mean, all kinds of things to plows made out of steel, which was much, much harder and lasted longer. New threshing equipment, and go watch the Amish farm sometime, and you'll see the new tools. Okay, it's that wave of technology. It is funny to me that that particular slice of the technological wave is holy and righteous. You know, at this point, that was the new technology. You know, I don't know if there were Amish at that point. They said, "Oh no, we can't use an iron-tipped plow. That's ungodly." I don't know, but it is funny to me that they picked that little slice. So anyway, a whole new wave of tools, that type of machinery that allows the farmers to be much, much more productive. So without giving you a list, we'll leave it there. The second thing is a whole new wave of methodology, new ways to plant crops, rotating crops, fertilizing, breeding of stock, cattle and things like that to get larger animals or more milk production. A whole wave of methodology, the science improving here drastically. So we have the farms producing more and more fruit and crops. And it still goes on. We continue to have a smaller slice of our population working on farms, and the production of those farms goes up, and it has just continued on from this point, where fewer and fewer people, a smaller slice of the population is needed to run the farms, and the production just continues to go up and up and up. So, all right, so new methodology, new methods and scientific things developing. So, all right, the last thing to mention here with agriculture comes out of the South, and it's the cotton gin. Now this kind of blends you could say, well, it's a new kind of like an industrial thing or something, but the cotton gin is a particular development here. All right, who wants the easy question? Who developed the cotton gin? Eli Whitney. Anybody know anything about him? Please don't say he developed the cotton gin. Anybody know anything else about him? Yes?
He used mass production during the War of 1812 to produce muskets.
Okay, yeah, he was, what's the right word? He was a frontiersman in the area of mass production and standardized parts. It's something we take for granted, but he produced weapons for the government and military, and the parts were interchangeable. Right? Think about. Sorry, girls, don't pay attention. Think about when your car breaks down. You go to Advance Auto, and you buy the part and put it on. You don't have to go to a blacksmith with the old part and say, make one of these. They're sitting on the shelf. He did that with firearms. So he's involved in other things. But before all of that, he develops this cotton gin. He actually was educated as a school teacher, which those are always really brilliant people. Sorry. Educated as a school teacher, went to the South and was teaching and watched this process of pulling the seeds out of the cotton, which was a major bottleneck in the production. It took so much time to separate the seeds from the cotton that it actually limited the amount of crops that could be planted. He saw this and came up with he called it a absurdly simple contrivance. Right? A little machine that could be cranked and would separate this automatically. And we go from that in 1793, and then it gets improved, and then they start hooking steam engines up to it, and it continues to improve. It got to the point, let me give you some numbers here. In 1793, it took one slave a day to separate the seeds from a pound of cotton. His invention allowed that same slave to do 50 pounds of cotton. And eventually, that one slave with the advances could do 1,000 pounds of cotton in a day. So it took this bottleneck and just blew it wide open. And it allowed cotton production to explode across the South? Well, we're blowing up the bottleneck. We might as well allow the cotton production to explode. All right, so anyway, the cotton gin, it had a major effect there in the South with cotton. It set the stage for the South to dominate the world market of cotton. And like I said before, 7/8 of the world's cotton comes out of the South by the time of the Civil War. Major economic factor for them. So anyway, the cotton gin was a part of that. I've heard people kind of in jest blame Eli Whitney for the Civil War. Because without this invention, there would not have been the capacity to grow all this cotton and clean it. And so he opened up the thing for more cotton production, and it was his fault. So that's the other side. See, there you can blame the school teachers for everything, too. So, all right, so anyway, the cotton gin out of the South, very, very important particular invention there. All right, now let's look at the Industrial Revolution, kind of the factory and the side that produces all the pollution that's heating our planet up. That's not happening. It won't stop our president from going to Paris to combat global climate change that causes terrorism. So, all right, Industrial Revolution. The first thing I want to give you is two very basic kind of generalizations of the types of things that happen in this. We will look at some particular industries and examples of things here, but two general things that take place. The first is we see the progress from work being done by hand to work being done by machine. And the cotton gin is as good an example as that as anything. You're pulling the cotton out by hand, and then you have a big machine that you run the cotton through, powered by a steam engine. That type of change all over the place. If you ever hear people want to go back to the good old days, man, it's just a lot of hard, grueling work to barely survive. I'll take the advances of today. So, all right, and then the other change, we have from work done by hand to machinery. The other change is from things being made mostly at home, or in a lot of cases on site. A farmer has a farm and he needs something, so a spoke breaks on his wagon wheel, so he goes and cuts a tree down and forms it like Mr. Schreiber down in the shop. Instead of things being done at home in that sense, to being produced in a factory. All right? The factory system is extremely efficient. Since I have 3 children, I was once tortured with an American Girl movie. All right. And it was straight socialist propaganda. The whole film, you girls might know the particular doll. The girl in the movie was all concerned about the factories and the horrible working conditions in the factories. And these factory owners were evil and wicked. And, have you girls seen that one? What's the girl's name? Samantha. Socialist. I always point out to my girls, and we still talk about it. I said, remember when they showed the scene in the factory where all of these kids were in there working it was textile mill, they're making fabric. And they were talking about how bad it was. Did you notice the line of people out the door waiting for a job? Why were they there waiting for a job? Because they just loved torture? They didn't explain that, all right? The truth of the story, anyway. Factory system. Don't believe the socialist lie that it was all evil and bad. There are bad players in the factory system, just like there are bad players in the farming system. Right? But there was a vast improvement over making it by hand. And if you ever begin to doubt that, just don't buy anything from stores. Make it all yourself. Next time you want a steak, don't go to Jewel. Raise the calf and butcher it. Don't put it in the freezer that you bought at the store either. Really, the factory system is extremely efficient, and it's not the evil thing that the socialists make it out to be. So, all right, those 2 basic changes. Now let's look at some particular industries and areas where we see changes taking place. So, all right, the first one is steam power. We see the development of steam power. It's actually a British guy, James Watt, who develops the first practical steam engine. The idea was there. of boiling water and producing steam and then using the pressure that creates to operate machinery. If you've ever heard of somebody who was pressure cooking something and the lid blows off and you get tomatoes all over the ceiling or something like that. Right. That steam pressure, using that to produce some sort of movement in a machine. The idea was there before. He makes it practical. He comes up with a way to harness that pressure and that energy in a useful fashion. All right. If you produce a steam engine that you have to work on it 8 hours to run it for 30 minutes, how useful is that? Sometimes I think some of our machinery is like that. When we go to use it in the summertime, it takes us 3 days to get it running, and we run it for 2 hours, and then we park it. So, anyway, practical steam engine. That was him. James Watt was the guy that did that. Okay, next thing we have developing here some new classes of people as we enter into this industrial age. All right, the first one is investors. If I didn't like them, I would call them speculators, but I like them. They're the investors. The owners of these businesses. Somebody produces a factory, the factory that Samantha, she didn't work there. She was worried about the children working. The owner of that thing, he puts out a lot of money to build the buildings, buy the equipment, buy the raw material, pay for the labor. An investor. We're familiar with that idea today. It existed before this, all right, but much more so we see this developing here. The idea of someone investing money to create a business. So investors. The other is a laborer, just somebody who works for a wage. Again, that existed before, but we see it expand drastically, especially in the north with these factories. There's a whole lot of people, they weren't working on their farm, their family farm, growing crops and raising animals. They were just going to the factory to work. So just a laborer in that sense. What I think probably most of you are. You're not an owner of the store that you work at probably. Anybody you're doing farming at home, well, maybe the Paytons, and you're living off of it. Most of us are just laborers. We don't own the business, and we're not working at our own family farm. We're laborers. So that idea, again, it existed before, but we see much more of this developing here. So two new classes of people expanding, at least. All right, the next area to talk about is transportation. Basically, it gets faster and more reliable. Anybody want details? Let me give you a few details. All right, first one is roads get better. Eventually get to basically gravel-type roads. Get to that point. There's one point, they would call them corduroy roads. This had to have been extremely uncomfortable. All right, muddy spots in the dirt road, they would take logs and lay them perpendicular to the direction of travel. So imagine hitting that with a wagon. Had to have been horrible. Anyway, all kinds of improvements in roads, going from just dirt paths to elevated roads and gravel roads, so much easier to travel that way. Well, this is something we take for granted. I traveled to West Virginia and back over Thanksgiving, and I really didn't wonder, how are we going to get around that particular mountain? Will we have to, there's a road, just drive down the road. Don't worry about the potholes too much, just drive. So anyway, that major improvements in roads. Okay, another thing to mention with transportation is rivers. We see river transportation improving drastically through this time. There had always been a lot of river transportation one direction. Okay, which direction was the easy direction? Yeah, go with the current. All right, this up in this part of the world, people would take their cargo to the river, cut down a bunch of trees, make some sort of log raft, throw everything on it, and just float with the current down to New Orleans. Then in New Orleans, they would sell their cargo, take the raft apart, and sell the lumber, and come back home. It was much more difficult to take stuff upstream. Okay, and we have here the development in 1807 of a boat powered by a steam engine, the first practical steamboat. Again, the idea was there, and people were trying to make it work, but the first time it actually succeeded and was, reliable. 1807, a guy named Robert Fulton did that. and it could blaze away upstream at 5 miles an hour. Whew. Hold on to your hat. So, but the point was, it could actually go upstream, okay, as opposed to boats where the keel boats where you'd have a whole bunch of guys on either side of the boat with long poles, and they would jab the pole into the ground and push the boat along. And once you got to the end of the boat, you'd pick your pole up and go to the front and push the boat upstream. There's some ways to do it. It was extremely difficult. This thing ran by steam, and it would take the stuff upstream. So 1807 was the first. And very quickly over the next several decades, we have dozens and dozens of these boats going up and down the Mississippi especially. So, all right, so river travel improves. The next thing to mention with traveling is canals. This is a short-lived thing, but there begins to be a lot of canals dug, especially across the north. If you can see the map, all of these light blue things are canals. Right? And I used to think, what's the big deal about a canal? I mean, you got rivers, a canal, isn't it basically the same? The thing with the canal is they didn't have a current. They would make them level. So you didn't have the current either way, and they would make them consistent in width and depth, and they would have a path beside it so that you could tie your boat up to a cow and let the cow just pull you. so significant advances over a river with these things. Obviously, there's a little bit of labor constructing them, but once they were built, they were better than a river. So lots of times we have them following rivers basically because you need some source of water to keep them filled, but they were better than rivers. You might be wondering, well, what do you do when it's not flat? That's where they'd have to build locks and things and raise the elevation up and move on. So, all right, but canals, relatively short-lived, but here in the early 1800s especially, there was a lot of canal building. There's some funny stories of, I think it's this one down here in Indiana. When it got built, they were kind of having a special day, and all of the ladies came out in their dresses to ride down the canal boats, and then the boat turned over. And they didn't drown or anything because there wasn't a special day, but they're out there all muddy in their fancy dresses. And so, all right, last thing with transportation, almost said it, is railroads. All right, this becomes a major point of transportation. We still go up and down rivers with boats. We don't do canals too much anymore, and definitely still do railroads. So, all right, it was 1830 when railroads began to be built. And here's a little piece of knowledge that you'll never need anywhere ever in life. The last surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence dug the first shovel of dirt for the first railroad. You know, they always have those where they come and take a picture with the shovel. They weren't taking pictures, but that symbolic first shovel. Anyway, Charles Carroll was his name. But 1830 is when we see railroads beginning to be built. And very quickly we see thousands of miles of railroads spanning the country. By 1840, there's 3,000 miles. By 1860, at the time of the Civil War, 30,000 miles. Right? You can see this goes up to 1860. You can see all of the black tracks of railroads all over the country. And it should be, I hope, pretty easy to appreciate how a railroad is better than hauling stuff on a cart with a horse, or throwing stuff on a boat and going downstream, or even canals. Right? You can run the railroad wherever you want to, basically. It doesn't have to be connected to the water. There's major advances. We still use them today. So, a couple of things about the railroads very quickly. The first ones are extremely rough, not necessarily rough ride, but the machinery was rough. These coal-powered engines billowing smoke and sparks on all the train cars behind it. So it's, go stand over a fire sometime, and that was your travel across country. So not very comfortable. But in time, they drastically improve them. The technology improves. We see iron being used for the rails instead of just steel. The machinery gets more efficient. So we have major improvements going on there. So railroads becomes a very, very important thing. Okay. The last thing here with technology at this time frame. After the Civil War, we will come back and look at, this wave continues after the Civil War, we'll look at some other things that develop. But the last thing for here is communication. Communicating. All right, two things to mention. First is Samuel Morse and the Morse code and the telegraph. 1844 is when he sets up the first telegraph between Baltimore and Washington. What hath God wrought was the first message he sent. Okay, so by our standards, that seems extremely crude. But imagine, Baltimore and Washington are 50, 60 miles apart or so, being able to basically instantly send a message, right? It wasn't quite a text message, but it was getting pretty close, right? It allowed a speed of communication that was unheard of before. So the telegraph, that was 1844. Eventually we have telegraphs going all over the place, even eventually across the ocean to England. 1858, the first cable was spanned across the ocean. It only lasted about 8 years and it was broken, but and it was replaced. But instant communication was amazing at that point. So one other thing for communication I have to mention, it really doesn't have a major effect on anything other than American Western legends. Anybody know what that is? It's a piece of the American West. It gets glamorized. The Pony Express. It does last April of 1860 through October of 1861. Not a very long little thing. But the Pony Express, it was a method of, they were trying to come up with a fast way to carry the mail. And the telegraph put them out of business, really. It was so much faster and easier way to communicate. Things that had to be quickly. Things that didn't have to go quickly. You didn't need the Pony Express. There's stagecoaches, eventually trains and other things. So, but anyway, it was there for a little bit, and it's, pretty much any time frame in from 1830 to about 1900, you can have some Western hero running into the Pony Express rider anywhere in the West. All right, so that really wasn't very accurate, but makes for a good story. Okay, so communication, definitely improvements there. Questions about the technology? All right, see you then.